So this lecture is about arousal. Arousal has to do with many aspects of psychology, and everything from memory to performance to sports. It also has a lot to do with stress. But we're going to talk about stress in a different lecture, so we're going to focus on some of the other aspects in theory about arousal and performance. So what is arousal? The activation of energy that occurs in preparation or doing actual behavior. So increased arousal will increase brain activity, which can increase performance in some tasks, but actually decrease performance in others. So there's the idea of physiological arousal. Heart rate increases, blood pressure increases, you might get sweaty palms, increased respiration. These are all sympathetic nervous system activity. And what I do in my lab is I measure some of these sympathetic responses while people perform certain tasks. So this is actually something I study a bit about. The parasympathetic counteracts the sympathetic. These are all part of your autonomic nervous system. These are autonomic, and I like to think about them as automatic, right? Because you don't have a lot of control on whether your heart rate increases or your palms get a little sweaty. So if you look at this, for example, in a sympathetic activity, your eyes will dilate, but in parasympathetic, they'll constrict. In sympathetic, you're not going to be taking a lot of blood and going towards your stomach to digest food. You do that in parasympathetic. Sympathetic is about arousal. It's the fight or flight response. And we can measure these different autonomic responses when people are performing different tasks. So in terms of brain arousal, which regulates the physiological arousal and back and forth, you can have a range from very deep sleep, where you have a lot of synchronized brainwave activity, to high arousal, which tends to have very high frequency, low amplitude brainwaves. How do we measure that? We can use electroencephalography, EEG, something else I have in my lab. And so when you're in deep sleep, you're talking about delta waves and theta waves. All these are just labels of waves that show the brain activity as being either synchronized or desynchronized. So in delta and theta, you're asleep and you have low frequency, high amplitude waves. When in a more wakeful sense, you have alpha waves and beta waves. These are when the brain waves are more desynchronized. And so you have different parts of your brain not active together, but active separate. That's a desynchronization. Wakefulness, arousal, high frequency, lots of brain waves, and low amplitude. I will point out, though, that during dreaming, during REM sleep, when you're dreaming, you can get into alpha and beta activity. Deep sleep is delta and theta. So let's look at these waves and what I mean by synchronization. This is a high frequency, many waves per second, 14 to 30 waves per second. That's hertz, cycles per second. And alpha is a little bit more synchronization. But look at delta down here, these slow waves. These slow waves. This is a deep sleep. There's a lot of other ways to measure arousal in the brain in terms of imaging. We just talked about EEG. There's also positron emission topography. And what this does is somebody is injected with a radioactive isotope, something that can be detective. Not radioactive like plutonium, that would kill them, but radioactive like a radioactive isotope that is coupled to glucose or even oxygen, and it goes up into the brain, and we can measure with this very, very sensitive piece of equipment where that radiation goes. Again, it's not the kind of radiation that hurts you. So the greater the radiation, the higher the concentration of, for example, glucose. So if in this case you have somebody with obsessive compulsive disorder, you have a lot of activity in the frontal lobe, and over here maybe a control brain, a normal brain, maybe both of them are doing the same task. and you can look at glucose metabolism by where it glows. So a functional MRI detects the energy waves emitted by hydrogen atoms by sort of lining them up with these very powerful magnets and then kind of like turning the machine off, and it readjusts these atoms. And if you put different radio waves through the brain while this magnetic system is on, basically what it tells you is where the most hydrogen atoms are located, and that can depend on how aroused the brain is. So it's just another way, without injection, of looking at brainwave activity by the concentration of certain types of atoms that spin differently and put off different energy depending on the magnetic field. Our brain is aroused from deep in the brain stem. The medulla down here, the brain stem, have several different types of nuclei that affect arousal. They put you into sleep, they wake you up. All down here, the reticular formation is highly activated when the brain needs to be very aroused. So this is kind of a picture of the reticular formation innervating and exciting the whole brain, arousing the brain. You know, if you're walking along and all of a sudden you see a stray dog coming at you, your reticular formation is going to kick in, and your brain is going to get very awake very quickly. But then there's the psychological arousal, which of course is a physiological construct, but we're going to look at it from more of a cognitive, perceptual, subjective level. Subjective feeling of arousal. We've all had that kind of very excited. Maybe you're excited by music. Maybe you're excited by an event. So you can differentiate those two types of arousal. At least Thayer did. Two dimensions of arousal. He called energetic arousal and tense arousal. Energetic arousal has a spectrum that goes from tiredness, early morning, to liveliness. And that's an energy kind of thing. High energetic arousal is a good thing. It's a positive feeling. Tense arousal is calm, relaxed, maybe even focused, but anxiety is at the other end. And a high tense arousal system is not something good. It's associated with negative affect, negative feelings. One way to monitor arousal activity is with the Activation-Deactivation Adjective checklist. And what this does is it asks people to respond whether they are very, very calm, just kind of very calm, whether they're not sure, or whether there's no. So this is a scale, and you might ask them to do this at different parts of the day. So scores are given on a 4 to 1 scale, 4 being very, that really defines their current arousal state. And these correlate with physiological arousal. So heart rate, galvanic skin response, something I measure in my lab, muscle tension, correlate with this scale, correlates with physical activity, correlates with the time of day, and this is really important to look at circadian rhythms. We'll talk about that in a second. So if you look at the arousal state based on this scale, where really the highest is occurring between noon and 2, and then we get calmer and more relaxed later in the evening and early in the day. And this correlates with those circadian rhythms. Circadian means circa, which means about, and dian is a day. Circadian, about a day, the rhythms your body goes through. Your body goes through temperature changes, hormonal changes, arousal changes. These are different fluctuations that the body goes through. So you can look at, this is 8 a.m., this is 8 a.m., this is the whole day. Just your temperature in the middle of the night, your temperature actually drops. Your blood pressure drops. Your hormones that regulate stress, cortisol, in the middle of the night drops. But look what it does right before you're waking up. You get this big increase right here. Well, these arousal states, these circadian arousal states, have a lot to do with health. And so people are more subjective to getting sick at different parts of the day. And also we see even such things as a heart attack. The likelihood of you having a heart attack changes throughout the day. And that has a lot to do with circadian rhythms and our physiological arousal state. What are the sources of arousal? Well, many things. Certain types of stimuli in our environment are arousing. Music, you know that. Your name, if you're walking along and calm and you hear off in the distance your name, you're going to orient toward that. You're going to have that arousal state. Some things are just called collative variables. These are novelty, complex, incongruent. Something is different. We are naturally, innately aroused to that. I mean, if you're an animal and you're walking along and there's these bushes and something is wrong about it, something is novel or incongruent or more complex, like a tiger, it's very important that your arousal state increases, because that arousal state is going to affect your survival during your evolution. But also there are ways of learning about arousals. There are rewards or expected rewards or incentives that come about from doing behavior, such as instrumental conditioning. But we can also classically condition arousal states. Ring a bell and give an animal a shock on its feet, and the bell will create an arousal state where they will either freeze or they will look and assess risk, and that's because they've learned to associate maybe stimuli that aren't arousing with other ones that are, or dangerous, and they go through this whole complex system of the amygdala, and we'll talk about that in a few slides. What about arousal and behavior? And this is very important when talking about motivating people to have their peak performance. One of the first things you learn is sort of this inverted U-shape idea that a very low arousal doesn't produce very good performance, but very high arousal doesn't do so well either. Super excited, super aroused can actually impede good performance. It's this sort of peak performance in the middle, this inverted U-shape relationship. So we're going to explore that a little bit more. Well, one of the most common theories or laws about this is called the Yerkes-Dodson model, and it's the idea that there is an optimal level of arousal that relates to performance. That's that middle ground, that inverted U shape. Low arousal produces maximal performance on difficult tasks. So if this is an arousal scale, very low arousal here, very high arousal at this end, a very hard task, you're really going to want to peak with at least a little bit of arousal, but not too much, because then you get flustered or you don't do very well. But high arousal produces a good performance with an easy task. For example, if you're going to sprint, you're going to want really high arousal. But if you're going to try to operate machinery or do something that takes dexterity, you're going to want low arousal. One of my favorite sports to watch is at the Olympics, is the biathlon. And that's a case where people have to shift back and forth. They're cross-country skiing, so you have a very high physiological arousal, and that's very good. Although cross-country skiing isn't that difficult, you're gonna want a high arousal. I mean, there is some complexity to it, but you're gonna want high arousal. And then you have to stop and you have to shoot a gun, and that's very high maximal performance on a very complex task, and you're going to want low arousal, so they have to shift and lower their heart rate and lower their autonomic responses. So the Yerkes-Dodson model is the idea that there is an inverted U-shaped relationship, but that depends on the type of task being performed. And that takes us to a whole area of psychology, a very prominent area. People go into this field and do quite well, and that is to maximize performance for people who are doing sports, because these are, again, that intertwine between easy and difficult activities. So here's one model that is talked about, the Cusp Catastrophe model. I like that Cusp Catastrophe model. And the model really is focused on getting people to perform at the best they can with sports. And this is a really complex thing. It's not always about training, because you could train in a very relaxed atmosphere, but then you get in front of a bunch of people, maybe it's the Olympics, and that arousal state really goes up, and you can't really deal with that very well. It's not how you were trained. And so the idea is to teach sports, people who do sports, athletes, how to get to that perfect level where they're still really highly aroused, but they're able to maintain that arousal level. So there are two types of arousals according to this model. There's the cognitive, that's that stress, that's that anxiety from being in a competition. And then there's the muscle arousal, the somatic, the physiological arousal. And that certainly has to be up, because you want blood flowing to the muscles and you want reaction times to be faster and other aspects that are going to help you in your sport. At low physiological arousal, maybe they're too tired, or maybe they aren't really pumped up for the game. If they increase the anxiety, that's going to help. A little bit of increased anxiety is going to serve that function to get the physiology working better. But at high physiological arousal, they're really excited and the blood is pumping. The high anxiety is going to produce a decline. And this isn't just a matter of telling athletes this, oh, have this kind of arousal or that kind of arousal. It's in training them to experience those types of arousal levels on a day-to-day basis that get them to that cusp, to that maximum performance, so that when they're actually performing it in competition, everything is very similar and they can reach that high level. So, mid to high range of cognitive anxiety, you want to be a little nervous, you want a little fear going on, and an increased physiological arousal leads to that perfect performance, that cusp they call it. However, going beyond that, and this is where I feel very sorry for people who, gymnasts and ice skaters, you go beyond that level of anxiety, and you start cutting into your performance. You start making those mistakes, and you go beyond that. In performance, you choke. It can get so bad with this that people can actually show tonic immobility. If cognitive arousal is so high, anxiety is so high, people can be immobile. And this is an extreme case. People that are in a car accident or in a plane accident and they have to get out. They might be so overstressed they can't move. They can't move. A tonic immobility. You see this a lot of times with crime victims. What about memory? How does arousal work with memory? Is memory affected in the same way by this U-shaped relationship? And can we bring in the Yerkes-Dodson model as well? Are there different types of memory depending on emotional arousal states? Well, let's take a look. So here's an experiment. It was done in 1986, and they investigated witnesses in a crime, 13 witnesses, and they interviewed the witnesses, and the police had interviews of these witnesses, so they were able to look at sort of the data the police collected and the data the researchers collected. And they kind of categorized these people into two groups, the high stress group and the low stress group. And they wanted to know the accuracy of what they witnessed. And what they found was, in both the researchers and in the police reports, that really high stress can increase memory. And we know this physiologically. We know that when you have a high stress level, you release different hormones that affect memory. Cortisol, for example, can go to the memory systems in the amygdala and in the hippocampus and tell those systems to work stronger, to work more powerfully. And you've probably experienced this, You had this very stressful event. You almost got hit by a car, or something happened that was very stressful. And you can have very detailed memories of those events. We look at this historically, too. I can imagine right now where I was, what I was doing. I was living in England when I found out that the planes had crashed into the Twin Towers in New York. I can picture my lab. I can picture the person who came into the lab to tell me that this happened, knocked on the door. Hey, did you hear this happen? I can see that whole event. I can't see those about other days, but I can see that. Very arousing. And so we know that stress can facilitate memory, and this is very important. But we're going to talk about this in the future, where stress and memory can actually get you in trouble. Post-traumatic stress disorder can be a problem of memory and invasive memories. So let's try an experiment. We're just going to have some fun, but this is kind of demonstrating these kinds of experiments that are done with memory. So here's the experiment. Ready? Here we go. Okay. So what was the main picture? What was the one in the front? Yeah, good. Okay, you got it. It was a shark. But what were the shapes around? Did you see the shapes? Can you name the shapes? What were the shapes? What were the colors of the shapes? Okay, so what happens with experiments like this is if the image is very arousing, then you have a focal or center point. The center focus of the picture is what you remember, but you lose memory of the periphery. What about if we had this one? Well, you can run this type of experiment, and people who aren't aroused by the center picture, it's just a boat, have better memory of the periphery. So central details are relevant and directly associated with the event. The ship and the shark. Those are the central details. The peripheral details are neither relevant nor directly associated with the event. And in my little experiment, those are the shapes and the colors that are surrounded. Students remember more central details and less peripheral details the stronger the emotion that is evoked in the central picture. So my shark, I don't know, maybe it made you a little scared for a second. That focused you on that, and you remembered the central details. Let's look at another experiment by Christianson and Loftus. Okay, here's what they did to their participants. They showed them 3 types of pictures. In one picture, and this is 3 groups. One picture, there was a neutral picture, didn't mean anything. A woman was riding her bike. It's no big deal. Right in the middle, a woman riding her bike, neutral. Another one was a woman carrying a bike. Well, that's kind of unusual. Doesn't mean women can't carry bikes. It's just not something you see every day. And then one with emotional. Now here, there's a bike, there's a woman, but the woman is on the ground bleeding next to the bike. Oh, that has a lot of emotions to it. In each slide, there was a car coming in the same direction. That's a peripheral thing. It's off in the background. You're not part of the central part of the photo. And then they tested these people with the same picture, with either the central woman missing, or the car missing, and asked, do you notice that things are missing in this picture, and if so, what? So, neutral, unusual, and then over here we have emotional. And what they found was the proportion of correct answers, the peripheral details. Neutral, they really noticed whether that car was missing. If it was an unusual picture, carrying a bike, they didn't notice it as well, but they noticed if the woman was missing. Emotional, again, the central details were really perfectly noticed, but not the periphery. So this is going at that kind of idea that the emotional quality of the picture allows us to either focus on the central, or the periphery. This happens a lot in crime, in witnesses to crime. If somebody pulls a gun on somebody and the police ask them, what did you see? They say, I saw a gun. I'll tell you about that gun. It was a silver gun. It had a black handle. It was big. It was all those things. What did the person look like? What was happening in the background? There's nothing there because you get very central focused. Now, Metcalfe and Jacobs, they talked about different memory systems in the brain. A cool memory system and a hot memory system. So the cool memory system is sort of responsible for your day-to-day memories. Where did I park my car? What did I have for lunch? Events that occur in time and space. Location, when did it happen? And they said that the part of the brain that's responsible for that is the hippocampus. And this follows the inverted U-shaped relationship of arousal. Too much arousal can reduce the effectiveness of the hippocampus memory system. Could be better at peripheral details. But as soon as emotional comes in, as soon as something scary or something exciting comes in to the memory system, the hippocampus doesn't work as well. It's the hot memory system. Now the hot memory system works better under high arousal. Now this is the hippocampus, but mostly the amygdala. The amygdala is learning those fearful things. Increased levels of arousal, increases level activity in the hot memory system. Could be better at the central or highly relevant stimuli and not so good at the periphery. So here's the amygdala, here's the hippocampus. You know, I have to say the amygdala and hippocampus do communicate with each other quite a lot. But if you see a snake, that's going to come up and it's going to be really learned about in the amygdala. If you see a blue car over there, your hippocampus is probably going to register it. You might remember it later in the day, not so important. So this is the kind of level, low level and high level. The hot memory system works better up here, and the cool memory system works better down here. It's a little bit like the Yerkes-Dodson, that it depends on the event. And now we have the optimal level of stimulation theory. All of these theories kind of get at this. There could be a set point for arousal. This is Zuckerman. Described an inverted U-shaped relationship between arousal and emotional tone, affective tone. Positive affective tone is the difference between relaxation and excitement. Okay? Calm and excited, and the negative affective tone is boredom. I'm not relaxed, I'm bored, and anxiety. And you get this kind of relationship here. Anxiety and boredom are unpleasant and will cause these sort of low behaviors. Relaxation is pleasant, excitement is pleasant, and you're going to see the better affective tone up here, but also better performance up here as well. So this is that kind of four-corner system that boredom and anxiety. Anxiety is a high arousal level, but it's not good and won't produce good performance. Boredom is low. Here you're calm and relaxed and your performance is good. Here you're excited and your performance is good. It's better to be up in this area here. All right? That's the end of section 2 for this class.